here, Mary. Over to the other side, will we? Look, over here.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening at Perlis Library for the closing night of this year's Tipperary Reads Festival. And I hope you've all had something to eat and a drink and that you're all sitting comfortably. And I'd like to especially welcome our author Stuart Neville, who's travelled all the way from Northern Ireland. It's his first visit to Tipperary Libraries, but not his first visit to Tipperary. We've had great variety in our festival this year, ranging from a lecture by Dr. Michael Kennedy from the RIA on the time period dealt with in the novel, and I know a lot of you were at that. And we also had a crime writing workshop with crime writer Arlene Hunt, and we had a lot of our aspiring writers at that, which was brilliant. And we also then had our Premier Short Stories writing competition. And I'm going to talk a little about that in a while, and I'll announce the winner. Thankfully, it's somebody from town. So firstly now, I'd like you to hand you over to Stuart, because I know you've read Ratlines, you probably have loads of questions. So Stuart will talk a little bit about the research that went into the novel, and he'll read a couple of excerpts from it, and afterwards we'll have a Q&A session. So anyone who has a question, please feel free to ask. So now here's Stuart for you.
I'm going to see how I get on with the microphone, if that's okay. I tend to wander about a bit as I talk and so on. So if you can't hear me, please let me know, and I'll think about putting back the microphone. First of all, thank you to everybody for coming, and thank you to Perlis Library and Lorraine and everybody at Tipperary Libraries who've invited me here. It's been a very good couple of days, and going around into libraries and talking to people. It's been very enjoyable. So thank you for that. So my name is Stuart Neville, and Ratlines is my fourth novel. My previous three novels were all set in Belfast in the present day. Mostly dealing with sort of the fallout of the Troubles and so on. I guess they could be described as thrillers, crime novels in the conventional sense. But Ratlines was something of a departure for me in two regards. One is a historical novel set in 1963. 1963 isn't very historical, it's only 50 years ago, but for me it's historical. But also set in Dublin, in and around Dublin, rather than Belfast, so it was taking a bit of a step in those regards. So when I was planning the novel, I first raised the idea of it with my editor, a guy called Jeff Mulligan. He's originally from Belfast, he works for Random House in London now. I brought the idea to him and I asked him, would it be feasible to write this book? And I use the word feasible because, not because of the stylistic change, the change of setting, but would it be legally feasible to do this? Could I write this without getting sued? Was the question. Because the book was going to probably feature a man I imagine most of you are familiar with, a Irish politician who had, shall we say, a colourful career, a certain Charles J. Howe. Thankfully, the answer was you can't libel the dead, so we're fine. I can go ahead and write it. I talked about my mentor, sort of developing the idea, and these different people that sort of whose paths crossed in Ireland at one time in the early 60s, and I went ahead and wrote the book and so on. But I started this year. I travelled to the States. I did a tour. I was going to different bookstores in different cities and having to explain to people every night who Charles Howe was. I don't imagine I have to do too much of that here. But I spent quite a bit of time explaining that he was actually real. I hadn't made him up. There actually was this guy who pocketed all this money, didn't get caught till near the end, and was brass neck on him like you wouldn't believe. And so yeah, again, I don't feel I have to explain the brass neck here really too much, but I'll do a quick sort of recap on him. You know, he was from a sort of impoverished background, a very staunchly Republican family. He very much a self-made man, pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and got his accountancy degree, passed the bar as well, and set his accountancy business in the 50s. and became very, very wealthy at a very young age. But never quite able to explain where the money came from. Far more money than a man in his career should have had. Certainly far more money than a junior politician would have had, logically. And of course we all found out eventually where the money came from, with the Moriarty Tribunal and so on, and all the skeletons came out of the cupboard. But where he comes into my story in ratlines was that in 1963, when the book was set, he was Minister for Justice. The Department for Justice, as well as what its title suggests, the justice system, having jurisdiction on that, it also is concerned with immigration and asylum seekers. So people who are coming to Ireland seeking asylum, or just general immigrants, it was the Department of Justice they would have dealt with. So that's how he crosses paths with my story. Now, I'm going to read a short excerpt from the start of the book. It pretty much sets up the premise for the whole novel. And it also introduces the protagonist, a man called Lieutenant Albert Ryan. Now, Ryan is an officer of G2, Director of Intelligence, which is the Irish Secret Service. Now, he, like something like 100,000 young men did during the Second World War, he went off and he fought on the side of the Allies against the Nazis. Came home, wasn't entirely respected by some of his neighbours for doing this. So immediately went back and fought in the Korean War, worked through the ranks, became a commando officer, and, but eventually was recruited back to Ireland into the Director of Intelligence, in the G2. But he, on this day, where this passage is set, he's been called into the presence of the Minister for Justice, who has a problem that needs to be solved, and only a man like Albert Ryan can do it. Albert Ryan waited with the director, Kieran Fitzpatrick, in the outer office, facing the secretary as she read a magazine. The chairs were creaky and thin-cushioned. Ryan endured while Fitzpatrick fidgeted. Almost an hour had passed since Ryan had met the director in the courtyard surrounded by the grand complex of buildings in Upper Merrion Street. The northern and southern wings were occupied by various government departments, and the Royal College of Science resided beneath the dome that reached skyward on the western side of the quadrangle. Ryan had expected to be ushered into the minister's presence upon arrival, and by the look of him, so had Fitzpatrick. Now Ryan checked his watch again. The minute hand ticked over to the hour. He'd heard the stories about the minister, a politician with boundless ambition and the balls to back it up. The upstart even married the boss's daughter, become son-in-law of the Taoiseach. Some called him a shining star in the cabinet, a reformist kicking at the doors of the establishment. Others dismissed him as a shyster on the make. Everyone reckoned him a chancer. The door opened and Charles J. Haughey entered. "Sorry for keeping you waiting, lads," he said as Fitzpatrick stood. "It was sort of late breakfast. Come on through." "Coffee, Minister?" the secretary asked. "Christ, yes." Ryan got to his feet and followed Haughey and Fitzpatrick into the minister's office. Once inside, Haughey shook the director's hand. "Is this our man, Lieutenant Ryan?" he asked. "Yes, Minister," Fitzpatrick said. Haughey extended his hand towards Ryan. "Jesus, you're a big fella, aren't you? I told you did a good job against those IRA bastards last year. Broke their backs, I heard." Ryan shook his hand, felt the hard grip, the assertion of dominance. Haughey stood taller than his height should have allowed, and broad, his dark hair slicked back until his head looked like that of a hawk, his eyes hunting weakness. He had only a couple of years' seniority over Ryan, but his manner suggested an older, worldlier man, not a young buck with a higher office than his age should merit. "I did my best, Minister," Ryan said. "Good. Sit down, both of you." They took their places in leather upholstered chairs facing the desk. Haughey went to a filing cabinet, whistled as he fished keys from his pocket, unlocked a drawer, and extracted a file. He tossed it onto the desk's leather surface and sat in his own chair. It thrilled with no hint of creak or squeak. An Irish tricolour hung in the corner, a copy of the proclamation of the Irish Republic on the wall, along with pictures of racehorses, lean and proud. "Who made your suit?" Haughey asked. Ryan sat silent for a few seconds before he realised the question had been spoken in his direction. He cleared his throat and said, "The tailor in my hometown." "And where's that?" "Carrickmacree." "Jesus," Haughey snorted. "What's your father, a pig farmer?" A retailer, Ryan said. A shopkeeper? Yes, Ryan said. He smiled, split his face, giving his mouth the appearance of a lizard's, his tongue wet and shining behind his teeth. Well, get yourself something decent. A man should have a good suit. You can't be walking around government offices with the arse hanging out of your trousers, can you? Ryan did not reply. But you want to know why you're here? Yes, Minister. Did the director tell you anything? No, Minister. Proper order, what he said. He can tell you now. Fitzpatrick went to speak, but the secretary bustled in a tray in her hands. The men remained silent while she poured coffee from the pot. Ryan refused a cup. When she'd gone, Fitzpatrick cleared his throat and turned in his seat. The body of a German national was found in a guest house in Salt Hill yesterday morning by the owner. It's believed he died the previous day from gunshot wounds to the stomach and head. His name was Helmut Krauss, and he'd been resident in Ireland since 1949. The Garda Síochána were called to the scene. When the body's identity was established, the matter was referred to the Department of Justice, and then to my office. Who was he? Brian asked. Here, he was Heinrich Kohl, a small businessman, nothing more. He handled escrow for various import and export companies, a middleman. You say here, Brian said. Meaning elsewhere, he was something different. Elsewhere, he was SS Hauptsturmführer Helmut Krauss, the main SS Economic and Administrative Department. That sounds rather more impressive than it was in reality. I believe he was some sort of office worker during the emergency. Government bureaucrats seldom called it the war, as if to do so would somehow dignify the conflict that ravaged Europe. A Nazi? Ryan said. If you want to use those terms, then yes. May I ask why aren't the Galway Garda Síochána doing with this? Sounds like a murder case. The war ended 18 years ago. This is a civilian crime. And Fitzpatrick exchanged a glance. Krauss is the third foreign national to be murdered within a fortnight, the director said. Alex Renders, a Flemish Belgian, and Johan Hambro, a Norwegian. Both of them were nationalists aligned to the Reich when Germany annexed their respective countries. And you assume the killings are connected? Brian asked. Well, all three men were shot at close range. All three men were involved to some extent in nationalist movements during the emergency. It's hard not to make the logical conclusion. Why were these men in Ireland? Brian asked. Renders and Hambro were refugees following the liberation of their countries by the Allies. Ireland has always been welcoming to those who flee persecution. And Krauss? Fitzpatrick went to speak, but Holly interrupted. This case has been taken out of the guards' hands as a matter of sensitivity. These people were guests in our country, and there are others like them. We don't wish to draw their attention to their presence here. Not now. This is an important year for Ireland. The President of the United States will visit these shores in just a few weeks. For the first time in the existence of this republic, a head of state will make an official visit. And not just any head of state. The bloody leader of the free world, no less. And not only that, he'll be coming home to the land of his ancestors. The whole planet will be watching us. His chest seemed to swell as he spoke, as if he were addressing some rally in his constituency. Like the director said, these men were refugees, and this state offered them asylum. But even so, some people, for whatever reason, might take exception to men like Helmut Krauss living next door. They might make a fuss about it. The kind of fuss we could be doing without when we're getting ready for President Kennedy to arrive. There's people in America, people on his own staff saying coming here's a waste of time, when he's got Castro in his backyard and the blacks causing a ruckus. They're advising him to cancel his visit. They get a sniff of trouble, they'll start insisting on it. So it's vital this be dealt with quietly, out of the public gaze, as it were. And that's where you come in. I want you to get to the bottom of this and make it stop. So that's basically the premise of the book. This idea that a string of people who've been killed had either were Nazis or were tied to the Nazis during the Second World War. And the idea of this book was planted by a documentary I watched a few years back. Some of you may have seen at the time it was broadcast on RTE. It was called Ireland's Nazis. It was by Cathal O'Shannon. And basically covering the same ground that I'm covering in the book. You'll have seen the display. It's a very good display that's around the corner, just a few of the sort of usual the rose gallery that O'Shannon covered in this documentary. The documentary surprised me in two respects. I think I know, like most people, that some Nazis had come to Ireland. Like, most countries around the world had a few Nazis slipped in somewhere or But I always assumed two things. One, that they were small in number, and two, that they had come in illicitly, some way being smuggled in or sneaked in through some back door. But the two things that O'Shannon's documentary revealed that surprised me was the sheer number. I've read estimates up to 200 people came to Ireland after the Second World War. Now, in most cases, they were members of local SS groups in various countries. For example, the Besom Perro in France, who were Breton separatists who fought in the SS uniform against the French resistance. Groups like that, rather than collaborators rather than actual German Nazis. But there were a lot of them, there were up to 200. The second thing that really surprised me was that in many cases it was with the complicity of the state. It wasn't that they had been smuggled in or snuck in, they had actually been assisted by the state, in many cases by the Department of Justice, in getting into Ireland. Does that start me thinking? Is there a story in this? I'll just go through a few of the characters who showed up here. Probably the worst of them in terms of the blood on his hands was a man called Andrija Artakovic. Andrija Artakovic was a minister in the Stasi, the puppet government in Croatia that the Nazis put in place when they invaded. And he copied the German model of concentration camps and is believed to have killed something like 750,000 people in his time in the government. After the Second World War, he was aided by Irish embassies, given travel papers, false name, lived in Rathgar for, I've heard different reports, between a year and a half, taught history. Was there, he didn't stay for long, he was staging post when he wanted to go to America, where he was eventually caught, recognised, died in custody before he could be executed for his crimes. But yeah, he bounced through Ireland on his way, again with the full cooperation of the Department of Justice. Another one, Peter Menton. Again, there's a picture of him on the board over there. Peter Menton, he was a Dutch nationalist who, again, like many of the local groups that the Nazis sort of reined in, he was given an SS. People in small authority in various areas were drafted into the SS or given SS uniforms and all the authority that went with that. So Peter Menton became an SS officer when the Nazis invaded home. And first thing he did was killed all his business rivals. The second thing he did was to go around his own town and the neighbouring towns and killing every Jewish person he could find. The figure I've read is 30,000 people. He also liked to liberate the art that they owned as well. He once had an art collection that was so large he had his own private train to transport it. He bought a mansion in Waterford in 1964 and lived there quite happily for 10 years. But he was advised by De Blair's staff to come in under an assumed name, not come in under his own name, which he did. It wasn't until he went back to Holland for a holiday in the mid-70s that somebody recognised him, and he was captured and arrested and stood trial. When he was eventually released in the 80s, he tried to get back into Ireland, and thankfully at that time the government had copped on and wouldn't let him back in. But his mansion, as far as I know, changed hands to an English couple and was put for sale in 2011 for €3 million. So I think it wasn't a bad spread that he had. There's another name I usually mention at this point. I can't because I'm being filmed, because I wasn't allowed to mention him in the book. A well-known publisher in Ireland, I shan't name, but he was believed to have been a translator for the SS when they interrogated resistance fighters. He translated the sessions and so on. If I remember correctly, he was given a death sentence for this. Managed to escape, came to Ireland, became a very successful publisher. Albert Leaks, who was tied up with Haughey in the arms crisis, was sentenced to death as a Flemish nationalist. He again escaped, came to Ireland, established a very successful, I think, chain of restaurants and hotels and so on. So the list goes on. You know, not all of them were so high profile as those figures, but many of them were just very minor soldiers and so on. But they found assistance and came to Ireland. The most notorious of them all, well, the most famous of them all, and some of you may have heard of them, if you're interested in the Second World War, you may have heard of them already. Colonel Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny, where to start? He, the first thing is I couldn't make him up. You could not make Otto Skorzeny up. Physically, he was 6'5", built like a brick shit house, a big, huge mountain of a man. Had a massive scar that ran from his eyebrow right down onto his chin. He's actually called Otto Scarface Scorzeni. And you couldn't get better than that for a villain. And his reputation through the Second World War, what he's most famous for, was when Mussolini was overturned by his own people and the police held him captive in a hotel on top of the Gran Sasso mountain range. This hotel became his prison. So as the official record goes, Scorzeni led the mission to rescue Mussolini. He landed a fleet of gliders on the top of the mountain. The Carabinieri, on seeing these Nazis landing on top and just dropping their guns, were terrified. They didn't put one single shot was fired. Scorzeni ran into the hotel, found Mussolini in one of the rooms, said, "Oh, Duce, I've come to rescue you." Whisked Mussolini down to this waiting prop plane and flew him straight to the Wolfslev, took him straight back to Hitler. And this was a huge thing, a propaganda coup for Nazis at the time. Even Churchill, a couple of days later in the Commons, commented on how daring this rescue was that Scorzeni had carried out. And Scorzeni's record through the war went on like this, all these different missions. He led a team in American uniforms during the Battle of the Bulge, went around and issued false orders, and this kind of very daring exploits. After the war, his record, his career after that was equally as colourful. His first destination was Argentina, where he lived under Perón's care. He's believed to have had an affair with Eva Perón, with Evita, and saved her from assassination and so on. He's rumoured, when he left Germany, he and Martin Bormann had siphoned off something like $800 million from the Reich's own bank accounts. Bormann, as far as you know, never made it out of Berlin, but Scorzeni did. Is believed to have taken this money with him to Argentina, where it rested in Eva Perón's bank account for a while, until he eventually left. He then went to Franco's Spain. He was a very close friend of Franco and the fascist regime there. He ran mercenary courses in Spain. If you wanted to put together a small army to overthrow an African government, you want to see Scorzeni. He had a group called the Paladin Group, and he would recruit mercenaries for you, he would train them. He ran courses. And actually, I was on tour at the start of actually last year, before when I was writing the book, and I was touring with an American guy called James Benn, who writes thriller set during the Second World War. And we were in a bookstore in Houston, Texas, and he introduced me to a man in the audience that he knew. Well, this man was very interesting. He started telling me about his friend, and he's very clear on this point. It was his friend he was talking about, not him. It was his friend who was in the CIA. And his friend, not him, his friend, had gone on one of Scorzeni's training courses in the 70s. And he said the most interesting thing he saw in this course that Scorzeni showed him how to do was how to make a dust bomb. He explained in this great detail how this thing worked. You'd have a room full of people like this, and the bomb would be planted in here, nobody knew about it. And the bomb was in two stages. The first was very small, explosive, very, very small. All it would do was explode an outer layer of sawdust, very, very fine sawdust, into the air. So the room would just fill with sawdust. The second device was an incendiary that would ignite the sawdust, so we'd all burn alive in this room as well. And this Scorzeni, this is what he was, part of what he was making his living, so he was trying to make bombs like this. And it's remarkable, then when you describe Scorzeni, you talk about all these things that he did, it's hard to believe that he was real. And then you imagine he's going to live in a hollowed out volcano somewhere, not on a sheep farm in Kildare, which is where he spent 1959 to 1969. He bought Martinstown House in Kildare, raised prize-wing sheep. It's still there, it's a guest house now. I've never stayed in it, but I'm tempted to go there. But he lived very basically 1959, 1969. What I find most remarkable about Scorzeni's time in Ireland was that he didn't live in secret, he didn't live in hiding. He lived very, very openly and became a society figure. He would be pictured in the Irish Times every other week at some function or another. He became a local celebrity. He was regarded as this kind of Scarlet Pimpernel, this very daring, sort of dashing, sort of almost matinee idol kind of man. And he actually relished this sort of minor celebrity that he had. But where it really got interesting for me in terms of this story was that in 1957, a couple of years before he actually moved to Ireland, he was a guest of honour at a reception at Portmarnock Country Club. And there's a photograph of him there, shaking hands with none other than Charles J. White, which I thought was interesting. And it seemed like the kind of men, sort of men who liked a bit of power and glamour and kind of thing, you know. It seemed like sort of taking paddle sort of chaps. So I wondered how much they knew each other. Now, when I was digging into this, I found something I thought was very interesting. It's a small thing, but I thought it was quite telling. If you go online, you can see records of all the debates in the Dáil, going back decades. And there's a transcript of one exchange between Dr. Noel Brown, TD, and Haughey. I think Noel Brown was a thorn in Haughey's side for many years, but Noel Brown challenged Haughey in his role as Minister for Justice. This is in March 1963, this happened. He challenged Haughey and asked him, was Scottish Scorsese resident in Ireland, and was he going to try to go for citizenship? To which Haughey said, no, Scottish Scorsese doesn't live in Ireland, no. Despite the fact that everybody knew he did. He lived just out the road. He'd been living there since 1959. He was in the newspapers every other week. But Haughey just lied through his teeth. The Dáil. Just barefaced lie. So I'm going to think it even harder. Was there some sort of relationship between these men? Now, I won't say everything in the book, but that's the relationship between Haughey and Scorsese is described as entirely fictional. That's what I've described as far as I know. That's the extent of their real life relationship as far as I know it. But Scorsese, I keep using the phrase, I couldn't make him up. You couldn't make him up. You know, if I tried to make up as a fictional character, nobody would believe me. I couldn't make him up. He did. The thing about Alan Scorsese was he's a fraud. Everything about him, almost everything about him was fake. I didn't find that out myself until I was researching the book, and I'd actually had it half written. And again, I was travelling with my friend James Bell, the author who said stuff during the Second World War, and I was telling him about this book that I was writing. And he asked me had I seen this new research by Michael Robert Fortzik on Alan Scorsese. And what Fortzik had done, he'd gone back to the actual SS records, and actually talked about everything that he'd actually done during the war, not what he said he'd done. And all of a sudden, this entirely different person began to emerge. For a start, he was a mechanic in most of the early part of the war. They used the term in the rear with the gear. That was Alan Scorsese. He was showing people how to maintain armoured vehicles and this kind of thing. But he's known to be a good bluffer, a good talker, knew who the right people to drink with in the beer cellar and so on. And what actually happened to Mussolini rescue, what actually happened, he's managed to talk his way into the mission. And he was given the role of reconnaissance to map out Gran Sasso, where the hotel was, where the lounge, where he could land the gliders. He made a complete bollocks of it. Half the landers crashed, the men were injured and so on. Purely by chance, purely by luck, Scorsese's glider was the one that landed closest to the hotel. So he dashed in, as I said, found Mussolini, he said, "I'll do check, come to rescue," brought him down to this plane. This plane was a two-seater prop plane. It was only supposed to take Mussolini and the pilot. Scorsese insisted on getting in as well. And Scorsese is a big man, so the thing could barely take off, almost crashed into the mountain as they went, but he still got it back to Wolseley, presented Hitler with Mussolini. And the thing is, the Nazis were on the back foot at this point during the war. And the propaganda, people realised, no, this is a coup for us, we can use this. So they made Scorsese this poster boy, and they made up this fabricated account of the Mussolini rescue. And they even filmed the reconstruction of it and so on. It was entirely fictional. But Scorsese loved this. He lapped this up. He started to make up all these little legends about himself. I mean, one of the stories he told about himself. Part of the problem with Scorsese is that most historians base their accounts of him on his own memoirs, not taking account of the fact that he made most of it up. As most used diabolics. But he, for example, he very famously was wounded on the Eastern Front, got a stomach, shrapnel wound in the stomach, and insisted no medical assistance other than a glass of schnapps, so he could go back out and fight again until he was too overcome an injury and had to be sent back to Berlin. But when Robert Fortzik checked the actual SS record, it turned out he actually had a bad case of diarrhea. And that was the only reason he had to be sent back. So this started to kind of come out. And the character all of a sudden became a lot more interesting. I initially thought, no, this is the book ruined, my main villains turned out to be this fraud. Then all of a sudden it became a lot more interesting about this man who had built this huge reputation as this fearsome lawyer around himself, who was actually a really incompetent soldier, and just bluffed his way through his life. Anyway, but he wasn't the only person of this type to come to Ireland. He's not the only real figure to be in the book. There are a few people in the book who are, apart from Haughey, based on real people. The next reading I'm going to do is from later in the book. The biggest group of people that came to Ireland after the Second World War were members of the Besom Peril. Besom Peril was the resistance movement fighting for Breton independence, very strongly into Breton language, Breton culture, and so on. The leader of the Besom Peril was a man called Celestin Linné. Now, Celestin Linné garnered a reputation. The Besom Peril were given SS uniforms. When the Nazis invaded France, they went to groups like the Besom Peril, gave them SS uniforms, said, fight for us, when we win, you'll have your own independent country. Whether they ever got that, we'll never know, but that's what they were promised. So the Besom Peril fought in the SS uniform, and Celestin Linné's specialty was to capture and torture resistance fighters. That was their main task, was taking on French resistance. And he had a lover at the time, a woman called Francine Rozek. Somebody's called Fan Rozek, and she was also called the Red Virgin. She was a Breton novelist, wrote in the Breton language, poet, and so on, published all over the world, and she went to work writing propaganda for them as well. Now, both she and Linné came to Ireland after the war, lived until the mid-80s as far as the war. But the scene I'm about to read has a character called Catherine Beauchamp. And Catherine Beauchamp was a pen name that Francine Rozek used. Just to set up the scene, Albert Ryan has been tasked with investigating these killings. The urgency behind these killings is that the file that Hockey took out of the cupboard in that first bit that I read, it has an envelope in it, and the envelope was taken out of one of the dead men's pockets, this blood-stained envelope. It's just addressed to Olive Scorzeni. And inside the envelope there's a note that says, we're coming for you. So Ryan has been tasked with finding out who's doing these killings and protecting Scorzeni. He's not too keen on having to do this. He's very conflicted about whether he wants to help these people or not. But in his investigations, he's figured out that the killers must have an informant. There must be somebody within Scorzeni's circle who is telling them who to target, what his movements are, and so on. So his investigation has led him to the home of Catherine Beauchamp, my stand-in for Francine Rozek, and she has a cottage in the Swords Estuary. But I'm just going to do a little tangent before I start the reading. Titles for books, I don't know if you ever, it's one of the realities of being a novelist. Titles are a vexed issue. I have had more long discussions with my publishers about titles than any of the content of any of the books. And I've had battles I've lost. For example, the 12, my first book, should have been called The Ghosts of Belfast. And it is called The Ghosts of Belfast in America, but here's the 12 because you can't sell a book with Belfast in the title. The worst bit you can try to sell is Belfast, because people just won't buy it. So, that kind of thing. But this book, Ratlines, I want to call it Dweller on the Threshold. And that phrase is explained in the first part of what I'm going to read. And I really insist on this. This is the title I really want for this book, Dweller on the Threshold. And my UK publisher kept asking me, are you sure? Are you sure about that? You don't want something a bit snappy, or are you sure? And I said, that means no, it's going to be Dweller on the Threshold, and I'm sticking to it this time. And my American publisher was saying, are you sure? You're really sure? You know, you have to think, people go into the shop and ask for a book, Dweller, that's a bit of a mouthful, something snappier. And I go, no, it's going to be Dweller on the Threshold. Then I got an email one day from my American editor, a lovely lady called Juliet, who simply asked, when you think of the real title, you'll let us know, won't you? So, Ratlines it was. Anyway. Short reading. Tell me, Captain Beauchamp said, do you know the term dweller on the threshold? Brad shook his head. No, I don't. It's a spiritualist idea, or occultist, depending on your point of view. There's different meanings to different people. Some consider the dweller a malevolent spirit that attaches itself to a living person. Others describe it as a past evil, a dark reflection of oneself from a former life. We all have this thing. Something that hides in our shadow, something that shames us. She studied the swirling blue patterns and the smoke that hung between them. I don't understand, Ryan said. What I did during the war, Beauchamp said, the people I allowed to attach themselves to me, the things I wrote, what I allowed myself to be in that life, all these, they are my dweller on the threshold. You mean guilt? Perhaps, she said. If I'd known the truth of it, the Germans who promised us so much, if I'd known what they were doing to those people, the Jews, the Roma, the homosexuals, I would have made a different choice. Do you believe me? Ryan did not answer the question. Instead, he asked, do you resent Otto Skorzeny? In what way? In any way. She laughed. I resent that he has grown rich and fat. I resent that his love for money and power has drowned the love of his country. I resent that he allows himself to be a show pony for the Irish bourgeoisie. Are those enough ways? Ryan leaned forward, his forearms on the table. Pages of poetry rustled beneath his elbows. Has anyone ever come to you and asked about Colonel Skorzeny, or any of the other people like you? She tried to hide it, but there it was, a flicker, then it was gone. People like me? Foreign nationals, Ryan said. Refugees from Europe. You mean Nazis, she said. Collaborators. Yes. She stubbed out the cigarette. Glowing tobacco embers floated up from the ashtray. Why do you ask me this? Whoever's been targeting Skorzeny's associates, your friends, my friends, they're not my, whatever they are to you. A well-trained and organised team of killers has been targeting them. And they have an informant, someone with access to Skorzeny's circle. Someone who has reason to turn against their friends. Someone like you. She shook her head, her eyes distant. This is nonsense. Where do you get this idea? Nonsense. Ryan kept a silence, watched her as she turned her gaze to the window overlooking her garden. Counting the seconds until she said, I would like you to leave now. Listen to me, Ryan said. If you betrayed Colonel Skorzeny, your only hope is to tell me now. If you pass on information to others, tell me who they are and what you told them. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't, not me. Ryan reached for her, touched her forearm, and she recoiled. You know what Skorzeny will do to you. Talk to me and I'll protect you. She shook her head and smiled. Oh, you are a child, aren't you? All my life I will. Paper scattered as she slapped the tabletop with her palm. If Otto Skorzeny desires a man's death or a woman's, then death will come. Don't you know this? He plucked Mussolini from a mountaintop. He fucked a Vita right on the Perron's nose. Then he robbed the fascist bastard blind and was thanked for it. This is his power, not an office, not a title. No law will stop him. Beauchamp stood, went to the sink, and gripped its edge. Ryan got to his feet. Please, you know the alternative. You know what Skorzeny will do to you if he gets to you first. Either you talk to me or... Her hand dipped behind the gingham curtain that hung below the sink. She turned, a small semi-automatic pistol aimed at Ryan's chest. Her hand quivered, the pistol jittering in her grasp. The other hand gripped the slide assembly and pulled it back. Ryan raised his hands as high as his shoulders. Does he know about me? She asked. I didn't give him your name, Ryan said, but he knows there's an informant. I found it without any trouble. He can do the same, and he will. Please, let me protect you. Tears sprung from Beauchamp's wide eyes, heavy, darkening her brows where they fell from her cheeks. Her breathing quickened with fear, her chest heaving. She wiped out her cheeks, sniffed hard. They told me I'd be safe. They promised me. It was my penance. I told them what they wanted to know so God would forgive me. Has God forgiven me? I don't know, Ryan said. Who were they? They showed me photographs, the children. Her free hand went to her belly, clutched at the flesh over her womb. The dead children, the bones, their dead eyes, their mouths open, flies on their lips. You didn't do that to them, Ryan said. He stepped around the table. Like you said, you didn't know. Please, put the gun down. Will God forgive me? I don't know. Catherine, please, put the gun down. Talk to me. We can work something out. You can run and get out of the country. She asked again, her voice firm and final. Will God forgive me? Ryan lowered his hands. Yes, he will. Catherine Beauchamp smiled. She opened her mouth wide, brought the pistol up, put the muzzle between her teeth and closed her eyes. Ryan said no, but it was done before he could take a single step. Thank you. At this point, I believe it's customary to open the floor to questions, so who wants to be first on the dance floor? Anybody? I'll go on. There you go.
Some of the interrogation pieces are quite detailed and quite graphic. How did you research them?
Funny, this question came up yesterday evening in Clonmel. There was a lady who told me quite frankly and honestly she didn't like the torture scenes. And I'll be honest, I actually agreed with her. I feel no writer's ever happy with the book once it's out and published. There's always something you want to change. The one thing I want to change about this book would be one less torture scene, if I'm entirely honest. Some of this, part of it is I don't know what motivates most writers. Me, I tend to write about things that either make me angry or things that scare me. And I'm encouraged to engage about injuries. Even the idea of cutting my finger makes me kind of go like this. So when I write something, I'll tend to hone in on the things that I know. I say, it might matter way of, what's the word, is it confrontation therapy you call it? Where you actually look things in the eye, the things that scare you. But the one that actually did take some research was I'm not sure, I'm quite sure I pronounce this, the Picanha electrica is a real thing, the little miniature, I'll not describe it, because it's what you can that is a real thing, was used extensively in South America. The problem is when you start to research a thing, particularly online, is sometimes it comes with photographs and you don't see them. So, yeah. A certain amount of research, a certain amount of grim imagination. Anybody else?
Just I found fascinating the way Celestin Laney progressed from normal human being with sexual torture, where you have it written that he found he kind of liked it and it progressed like that. He got more satisfaction out of it the more he did it and the more he experimented with different types of torture. Just found that fascinating, the way a human being can change from, say, I know, as I say, war brings up all this with, all the time anyway, with the inhumanity to man and that, but we wonder about the progression from, say, normal everyday. I know he was a nationalist, but becoming the torturer that he became.
It's a certain amount of speculation on my part, because, particularly I'm probably more liberal with the Cecil character than any other, because there's not a huge amount known about him. So there wasn't exactly a huge amount of research I could do. He didn't actually go under that name in Ireland. He used his Red Hunt name, which, off the top of my head, I think is Nevin Hanef. I could be wrong on that. So there's a little bit of separation between the character on the page and the real life figure. But that was his reputation as being an interrogator and torture, particularly resistance fighters. But I had two interesting conversations, one actually very recently, one a wee while back, about human beings' capacity for violence. One was with a forensic psychologist who worked with prisoners, and specifically she talked to me about paramilitary prisoners in the north. And the argument is often made that people wouldn't have been involved with violence if not for the circumstances around them. That if not for the conflict in Northern Ireland, people would never have lifted a gun, would never have been involved in crime and this kind of thing. And what she told me was that what they've found is that the people who got involved in violence had violence in them to begin with. It was always there. The conflict may have brought it out, may have given it an outlet, but it was there in them to begin with. But also, I keep mentioning my friend James Bennett. He's not published in Ireland or the UK, but James Bennett's worth reading if you're interested in Second World War. But he's done a lot of research into the psychology of warfare. What he was telling me, particularly when young men were drafted, conscripted or drafted into the army during the Second World War, and Vietnam was where this particular study was done. There's this, it's almost a myth that people can find themselves in warfare and all of a sudden have the capacity to shoot another human being, to kill somebody. They don't. They find that in Vietnam, they get young men 19 years old, jumping off a helicopter on the battlefield, have a gun, they just start shooting at the air. They shoot at anything, other than a person. And they'd empty every bullet they had just at nothing. Because they couldn't do it, they couldn't kill somebody. It didn't matter if they were shooting at them, they just didn't have it in them to do it. So it's something I've learned through, well, maybe anecdotal through other people's research, is that violence is an innate thing in certain people, and not everybody has it. And in terms of nature versus nurture, putting somebody into a violent situation will not make them violent if they don't have the capability in the first place. So, sorry, I went off on a tangent there.
No, it's just I was thinking about the puppy thing that he took on, on, and his love for the dog that was killed in the previous episode in the cottage in the countryside. And I was just thinking how kind and gentle he was with the puppy, and yet he could be so inhumane, like at the same time with the people he was dealing with, you know.
Well, again, people who are genuinely violent in their lives do have that contradiction in them. You know, you can get, you know, gang members or violent criminals who will quite happily break somebody's head with a baseball bat when coming from their babies. You know, it's just because you've one thing in you it doesn't blot out every other emotion that you're capable of having. But it's quite fun for a writer then to actually demonstrate or show that in some way on the page.
Sorry, did you kill him off as a kind of justice? Did I remember right?
Sorry?
He's killed off there, isn't he?
Yeah, Cecil Monet?
Yeah.
No.
No.
No, he doesn't die in the book. The only reason I used a different name for Francine Rosek was that she dies in the book, so I couldn't reveal. No, Cecil Monet lived until the 80s.
But he's the one that's betraying. He's a big online partner. So who was the insider in the end? It wasn't him.
It was him.
Yeah.
He kind of flits about from side to side.
Yeah.
He's kind of a very jittery moral-compass. He doesn't really know who to back. But in the end, he just kind of rides off in the sunset. He doesn't meet a sticky end because the real life figure didn't, so I didn't want to manufacture it. Therefore,
So her death was sad.
it was. I actually liked her as a character, but again, I had to use her pen name. I can't know she was actually the real person's pen name. I couldn't use the real person because she, as I understand, worked for a charity in Dublin up until the 80s when she died.
So you didn't want to lie for her?
Well, no, I didn't. Basically, I didn't want to come to an event like this and somebody say, "Hey, you killed Francine Rosek in that book," but you know she didn't die till the 80s, and then people quite often enjoy pointing out you got things wrong. So.
Very interested with the personality of C.J. Poppy. Like, I mean, he was portrayed in the book as a real bully, wasn't he? I mean, he bullied the intelligence directory of intelligence outfit. He bullied Ryan. He bullied everybody all around him. He came across as a complete and utter, I felt, as a bully.
As I understand it, I was helped in the research of this book by a friend of mine who actually knew Poppy at the time, when it was set. And what I was told is that he was a bit of a chameleon, in that depending on the circumstances, he could be very, very charming, very smooth, very friendly, very kind. Yeah. But he could switch that very quickly and be incredibly ruthless and domineering.
You had seen with the tailor, when Ryan went to get the suit from the tailor, and when he said to Charles, how he said to him, Ryan, the tailor actually paid. That was because he probably thought he wasn't going to get paid, was it? I mean,
that's kind of the hint, the straw. I was using that as kind of an allegory for the famous overdraft.
yeah.
And so
It worked.
yes, indeed. The suits thing and the tailor thing was kind of playing on something we all know, the famous facets of his personality. Anybody else?
Other Ryan is a made-up character. Who did you think of when you wrote about him?
As he developed, characters when I write them tend to come quite fully formed. I don't tend to be built as I write them. What will happen usually is that as I start writing them in the story, you figure out who they are really by how they act. And this sounds like a bit of a hackneyed phrase, a bit pretentious, but the kind of characters kind of tell you what they want to do in any given situation. But with Albert Ryan, and it kind of plays on this through the course of the book, I kind of thought of him as being basically a kind of a secret agent, but a bit crap. You know, it's kind of almost an anti-Bond, in that there's nothing glamorous about what he does. There's no secret gadgets. He doesn't even have a gun until he steals one. So I kind of try to make him the exact opposite of what we normally think of as the literary secret agent, the Fleming style secret agent, and then he's completely incompetent with women. He doesn't know how to deal with anybody socially. He's not the slightest bit suave or sophisticated. So that's really how I had in my head. If you can imagine just the polar opposite of Sean Connery or Daniel Craig, that's who was in my head. Anybody else?
Do you intend writing another book with Albert Ryan?
Yes, I've loose plans for a trilogy. It won't be for a couple of years because of the honest amount of research has to go into them. I'm thinking of writing something based around the arms crisis. What I think of a trilogy that will have Albert Bryan and Haughey crossing paths at sort of quite distant time intervals over the years through Haughey's career. So maybe a book set around 1970, maybe a book based set around 1979, 1980, that sort of period. But there'll be some time between each book simply because it takes so long to sit and study all the background to them and so on. But yes, in short, yes.
Yeah, I kind of take that at the end of it. I want to kind of lead you into it.
I mean, my publishers did sort of suggest the idea of having a story on my agent as well, having a story that would sort of pick up immediately after Ratlines and having a series based around the early 60s, but it wasn't really what I intended when I set out with that. I do have in mind setting around specific historical episodes at certain periods of time and limiting it to maybe 3 books. But they may never get written, you never know. Something else may take over. That's good.
Do you think the Ratlines as a title is more generic, that you could bring it up to date, like the rats that are sneaking into countries all over the world, or would it not be something you...
Well, the term Ratlines, it was the term used for the Nazi escape routes.
So it's particularly for Nazis, is it?
It was. I mean, I think it's become to be used now as a term to mean any kind of secret channel that people use. The term actually comes from ratlins, which are the riggings between masts on a ship that sailors would use to get from one mast to another. They're called ratlins, and it became bastardised to ratlines. Particularly that was applied to the Nazis. They escaped Europe, primarily through Spain and some through Northern Europe. Was the term. But it's snappier than dollar. The threshold have to. So, well, at that time, historically, bear in mind that's just after the border campaign, and they were in disarray and also in flux from being quite right-wing and making a transition to being more left-wing. And their politics, as I understand it, I'm not a historian, but as I understand it, the border campaign was kind of the last shout of the old sort of more right-wing aspect of the IRA, and what came out of the ashes of that would go on to become the official IRA and provisional IRA, which was the more Marxist-leaning group that we know and love today. Yeah, at that time, I think to be fairly accurate, they weren't in a good shape at that time. They were pretty much dismantled during the border campaign. So I think that might be almost us. Yeah. Just in closing, I have a standard stake I give at these things. Two institutions that I think we should all treasure and support and protect as much as we can. One of them is libraries. I've got a connection with libraries all my life. My mum worked for the library service. We didn't have money for books, so I had a steady stream of books to the house simply because of the library service in Norman, where I grew up. My wife's a librarian. Most of Ratlines was written in the library. I owe my career to the fact that I got to start with books and reading as a kid, because in libraries I wouldn't be standing here tonight having the luxury and the great privilege of doing what I do for a living if it wasn't for libraries. They are a very precious thing in our communities for many, many reasons, and I think they're worth protecting, so I appeal you to always support your local library. The second thing is independent bookstores. I owe my career in the States to independent bookshops. When the big chain stores didn't want to know me, it was the independent bookstores who sold the books by hand and got me a foothold. We can't be beholden to the big chain stores and the stock that they've been paid to place on the front tables as a means of finding books. We should treasure our libraries and our independent bookstores because they're too important to us as communities and as society to let them slip away due to finances and all those commercial reasons. So that's it. So thank you to, again, for everybody coming. Thank you to Lorraine, who's been shepherding me about since yesterday, did a very good job, and to Phyllis Library for helping me. So thank you.
Stuart, I know Stuart has a legion of fans in Tipperary after the last couple of days, and you'll be happy to know he's just finished a new book. That should be out sometime next year.
Hopefully next summer.
Yeah, so if anybody's interested, put your name down, get in there first, get the request in. So if you bear with me now just for a minute, I just want to talk about our Premier Short Stories writing competition. And I would like to first of all say thank you to North Tipperary County Council Arts Office for, again, this year they very kindly sponsored the competition. Without them we probably wouldn't be able to do it. And we then, this year, had a judge from South Tip. Her name is Dervin Adromi. Unfortunately, she can't be here tonight. So what she's done is she's given me her words that she'd like to pass on to the shortlist entrants and also to the winner. So if you just bear with me. We had a fantastic turnout this year. We had 26 entries and fantastic talent. And what was really fantastic was that we had the whole county was represented. We had people from Bursakane, Clough Jordan, Carrick-on-Shore, and everywhere in between. So it really was a county-wide competition, and I'd like to encourage that to happen again next year. So if there are any writers amongst us, please do submit an entry this or next year. And I also would like to comment on the standard of writing. It was amazing, really, really stunning. I wish I could let you read them all, but just the talent in the community is fantastic. So I just wanted to note that. And from the 26, we shortlisted it down to 5. And they were White Tabitha Gold Won't Eat Apples by Louise Garcia, Mick's Big Night Out by Ben Williams, Nexus by Ken McGrath, Henry Joy, The Age of Reason by Seamus Sweeney, and No Room by Michael McGee. So Dervla says, it's interesting the way a theme naturally emerges in a short story competition, even when one isn't set. In this case, it was time. These stories took us into the future and into the past, sometimes at the same time. The stories showed great inventiveness and had a strong emotional appeal with well-drawn characters. There was plenty of humour, but also sadness, so these stories were a good reflection of life itself. Well done to you all for your courage and your passion. You all have talent, and I hope you keep writing. So on to the winner. When you're judging a short story competition, there are certain ingredients you look for. Ingredients with fancy names like plot, character, story development, and viewpoint. The winning story had a perfect balance of all these ingredients. It had an intriguing plot and a well-rounded character. It took the reader into a fascinating futuristic world that was also plausible, which is quite a feat. The story was well paced and the tension was beautifully built up throughout. I also admired the way the writer came at the story sideways. In other words, he didn't spell out what his character was feeling or what was going to happen. He dropped hints, and that's why the emotional punch at the end was so effective. The other stories on the shortlist had these ingredients too, but all of these ingredients aren't enough. There's another ingredient that makes a story stand out from the crowd. I call it the crackle. It's a pulse, an energy in the writing that makes you want to read on. It's an extra ingredient of passion for the story you're telling and for writing itself. Nexus was a technically well-crafted story, and it also had the crackle, which is why it won. Congratulations, Ken. Your piece was a masterclass in good short story writing. So I'd like to invite Ken McGrath, the winner of this year's competition, up to accept his prize of €200. TiperaryLibraries.ie very early next week, so if anybody would like to have a read, it's in there under Goodreads. So, and it's a lovely story, a lovely ending, and a very human story. So thanks, Ken. I think you really, really have a great career ahead of you. Ken actually won the competition back in 2010 as well, so he's barred at this stage. And I'd just like to say good night to you all, and thanks for coming, and special thanks to Stuart. I know it was a long journey down, and he's been fantastic with me and with his time for everybody, and he's just such a great writer. I can't wait to read the next one. Thanks.
Thank you.